everyone. Welcome back to LGB Alliance USA's YouTube channel. We have a very exciting guest today, the lead editor and founder of Jill Magazine, a new lesbian magazine that ships internationally. Very exciting. And so we are going to find out more about what this magazine's purpose is and about the people who created it. So for starters, Vera, why don't you just tell us a little bit about what Jill Magazine is and your mission?
For sure. That sounds great. Thank you so much for having me on. And so Jill Magazine is, I guess the mission is twofold. So it's a lesbian print magazine, as you mentioned. So print, we don't have a digital, I mean, we've got an Instagram page, but more just for advertising purposes, and a website, of course. But it is a print magazine for lesbians. And we define lesbians as adult human females who are attracted to other adult human females. Just to clarify, in case there's any question. And our mission is twofold. First of all, just to provide lesbians with an authentic forum for expressing themselves, whether that's through text like print or art or photography or however you want to express yourself, I guess, in print. And secondly, to support, challenge, and engage lesbians and our female allies with high quality, hard copy content that is thoughtfully curated and that promotes logic, critical literacy, and fun. So we strive to include a wide variety of photography, fiction, nonfiction text, and original art from around the world. Mainly, it is in English, so the English-speaking world primarily, although we did have some contributions from Berlin, Germany. That's inaugural issue. Very exciting. Well, I won't give too much away. We'll talk about that later. But anyway, we had contributions from Europe as well. That's basically content that's beautiful, insightful, authentic, provocative a little bit, and humorous, but all related, of course, to lesbians.
Wow, I love all of that. Would you say Jill is a political magazine or leans more lifestyle? Or, I mean, it sounds like it's a mix.
Yeah, so I've been describing it as, I don't know if y'all are familiar with, if your listeners are, if you're as old as I am, as familiar with highlights for children. You know, it was this magazine, I always found it in the dental office, you know, and it had like, connect the dots, and there were mazes and little short stories and comics and a little bit of everything in there. So it's kind of like highlights for children, except for adult lesbians.
That's fantastic.
And you don't have to read it at the dentist. You can read it wherever you want.
Maybe read it at the gynecologist. That might be.
Hey, that could be a great new marketing scheme there. Thanks for that. Let me write that down.
Yeah, no problem. So I guess my next question is why a lesbian magazine? Why is it important to have a lesbian magazine, or what made you think that this is something that the world needs, which I do think the world needs, but why do you feel that the world needs this?
Yeah, well, I think I mean, there is a little bit of a history of, lesbian magazines that I'm not super familiar with, to be honest, because I came out a bit later in life. I was 38, so I don't know, was that midlife, almost midlife, when I figured out that I think I might like girls, so I didn't grow up reading, like On Our Backs or some of those just classic magazines that I'm a little bit familiar with from the US and Canada, and maybe there was stuff elsewhere in the world as well. But even online lesbian spaces like Autostraddle, for example, which was one that my girlfriend, then now wife, sort of clued me into when we first were together. All of that stuff the print stuff is either out of print, or it, like online spaces for lesbians, seems to have been taken over with this sort of gender ideology and, trans rhetoric, which is, it's hard not to get political about it. And I don't want to, I mean, there's a space for that. There's trans identified folks who are looking for community, good for them. But I don't think lesbian spaces are where maybe they should or could find that. And unfortunately, that's sort of been happening increasingly over the past decade or so. And so I was looking for a magazine that I'd like to read as a lesbian, right? And there wasn't one. And so I thought, well, let's just well, then with my ample spare time, I'll just throw a little something together there and see how that goes. And it's been kind of a wild ride, but a little bit fun. We just got our first issue out the door. And we do have a few extras in case any of your listeners or watchers want to order one. We ordered a few extras just in case, you know.
Well, that is a perfect segue to my next question is how did you just from the ground up start this thing? I mean, was it just you or did you get a band of lesbians together and
I
how'd
wish
that
I had a
happen?
band of lesbians, although I am developing one over the last few months,
I
actually.
was thinking, what would you call a group of lesbians? I need to think about that.
I'm sure there's a good stand-up joke in there somewhere,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
um, well, so my last big publishing adventure of even remotely linked to this nature would have been, I guess, in my early 20s at a summer job. I had this we had this little anonymous Tribune that our shift, we had a number of shifts, that this was this big park, like summer amusement park. And our shift decided to publish this Tribune anonymously. And we had some serious articles, some fun articles, and our manager would sneak into the owners, like the park owner's office, and print it off surreptitiously on their photocopier. And then we distributed it out, and everybody thought that was great fun. It was just like a, 8.5 by 11 stapled together, black and white. And then we got busted after like 3 issues, and the whole thing got shut down. That was the end of that. But that was like 100 years ago, right? So things have changed a little bit, and now everybody can be a desktop publisher on their computer and all of this. So I just kind of put the call out to some lesbians I knew, and then started an Instagram account and got back into Twitter, which I'd sort of abandoned for a while, largely actually because of lesbians who reached out to me through the Instagram account, stumbled across it. I guess they used the right hashtags or whatever, and got me hooked in with a few international groups. This is sort of one of them. I know technically it's American, but there's a lot of little kind of cells and groups, lesbian cells all over the world, that people log in together and chat, not always with video, sometimes just, by text or audio. And so I started to meet women who were keen and interested and wanted to contribute. And I started to GoFundMe because I thought, how am I going to pay for this thing? It'll maybe be like, if I want to print 200 or 300 copies, maybe it'll be like, $3,000 or $4,000. Well, I called the publisher, and to have like an actual magazine editor publisher was going to be the cheapest one I found was about $20,000. So I was like, I don't think I can raise 20,000. And my wife said, absolutely not. I'm not paying for that. So I put out a GoFundMe just to see what would happen. And we raised, between that and people's PayPal contributions, we probably raised about $3,000. So, and the total cost to print self-publishing online ended up being about, I want to say, close to 6,000. So, but that was with these few extra copies ordered. So, it almost paid for itself. There was no advertising this first issue, but yeah, it was essentially, let's see who contributes something. And if it's not all total crap, I'll put it together and try to make it look marginally professional, and let's see what happens. And so part of it was me reaching out to lesbians I knew, and part of it was lesbians crawling out of the woodwork and finding me. And so it's been sort of this group effort, but mostly virtually. Ironically, for a print magazine, most of the work has been virtual. And then now there's this thing that arrives in people's mailbox, and it's very exciting, and they can open it up and there's lesbians inside, lots of lesbian content.
Sounds like a dream. Two questions. Uh, One, if someone wants to order a magazine, how can they go about doing that? And two, if somebody wants to say, come work for you, or perhaps it'll probably have to be a volunteer thing, I'm assuming. Eventually, hopefully, people can be on the payroll, but as a lot of grass movement projects go, it takes a lot of sweat in without money, but passion fuels the project, I think. So if someone wants to get involved with contributing or helping with Jill, how would they do that? And then if someone just wants to purchase to read, how do they do that?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So because this first issue is just sort of an experiment, like I said, what we did was just sort of a GoFundMe. And then that way it's like there's no business, there's no taxes or any of that. So people can make a donation through the GoFundMe, or if you don't like that, you can PayPal, or if you're in Canada, you can e-transfer. And so the best way to do that is through the website, jillmag.weebly.com. So jillmag.weebly.com. And there's a subscriber button, and you click on there, and there's a link to the GoFundMe page, or you can just contact me directly. And right now, what we're saying, the cost for an issue, including shipping out, is $30. If you can afford to do more than that, that's great, because that helps offset some of the costs, because we're also offering some discounted options. So, you know, not every lesbian has $30 kicking around, especially if you're young or unemployed or an actor or an artist, right? I know how it goes. So we're also saying, you know, if you really want a magazine, you don't have the money, you know, send us 10 or 15 bucks and we'll figure it out. But of course, if everybody does that, that's not going to work. So we need some people to pay a little more than 30 so that other people can pay less. So kind of pay what you can. And then we mail it out. So the first run, we were actually mailing out from my living room. It was mostly me, and I had some female friends helping out. And we put stickers inside too. So if you get this, I don't know if we'll do it for every issue, but this first one, very 80s. I'm a child of the 80s. So you get your magazine and you open it up and there's stickers inside. So fun. And we were putting stamps too. So it's mailed from Canada. So you actually get Canadian stamps, except now you don't, you're just going to get a postal label because I'm in Mexico. So I promised on the website, no male hands would touch this, but it's a lie. One of my twins who still lives at home is mailing out every time there's a new subscription, I text him and say, I need you to the post office tomorrow. I pre-stuffed a bunch of envelopes for him, but he's just going, he's not putting stamps on. So it's not as exciting as the first run, but it's still the same fabulous content inside and mailed from Canada. And that's that. So that's how you get a copy. If you want to get involved, and I'm glad you brought up the whole volunteer thing. Yes. So this first issue is all volunteer. Nobody got paid. I thought this will be a fun little project that'll maybe take 50 to 60 hours. It took about 500, but that's okay. It was the first go. And all photography and everything else was all volunteer. So people submitted stuff, and then we had volunteer editors, you know, and so that's kind of how it went the first time. We are accepting submissions all the time. And the website there's a submission button, so you can kind of see the sorts of things, the kinds of columns we envision. And if something pokes you in the eye and you want to write about it or take pictures or whatever, by all means, message us, and, you know, we'll give you our email address and you can send it to us. But we're hoping for the future, it would be great if we could kind of become self-sustaining, because even if we don't pay people full salary, it'd be nice to give them an honorarium or something, because, you know, people shouldn't have to work for free all the time, I think.
Again, great segue to my next question, as what's your hope for the future for Jill Magazine?
Yeah, well, having just a touch of ADHD, I didn't really think beyond the first issue. I thought this is going to be great. And it was. And now people are saying, when's the next issue coming? And I'm thinking, no, like we're done. We did it. It's over. But I think it's not over, because I think one thing we've definitely seen here is there is a need and a desire for a lesbian print magazine. And so if we can make it work into the future, we will. My thinking is, you know, maybe once or twice a year we publish something. So my goal for the future, for the immediate future, within the next 4 to 6 weeks, is to get together a volunteer board of directors or directresses, I guess. And so in the magazine, if you order one or you read one, you'll see it. There's a QR code that says, hey, do you want to join us? Click here. And then there's a little survey you can fill out. And we've got a very interested and I think quite qualified person from the US and another one from Canada and an interested person from the UK. But we'd like to get a group of 5 or 6 lesbians together with a sort of a variety of backgrounds and from different places. It would be great to have somebody from Australia or New Zealand join us, and then we'll get together and talk about what's next. Because I think there is a next. We just want to, we're not quite, I don't know what that looks like. Because it can't, like I said, it can't all be volunteer work on everybody's part forever. This first issue, and maybe, I don't know, this leads into a future question you might be asking, but for this first issue, we purposely didn't include any advertising, in part because we didn't want to get hijacked by advertisers or subject poor advertisers to getting canceled because somebody didn't like, you know, the content. So that was good because it allowed us some freedom. But what was bad about that is there literally was no funding other than what people sent us. And there were a couple of individuals who were quite generous and sent us a couple of $100. So that was great to sort of launch it and get it off the ground. But you know what, unless there's some wonderfully wealthy lesbian out there who wants to who wants to support us, you never know, there could be, because it's not a huge expense in the grander scheme of things. Like if we had a couple of women who said, I'm going to send you $5,000 every year, we could publish this thing and be in business and never be beholden to advertisers, you know. But I don't know if that's reality or not. So we need a board of directors. That's not a decision I can make on my own. I'm all about cultivating community here. So if there's anyone out there interested, join us.
I really, really like the idea of the magazine being, you said once or twice a year, maybe seasonal, like a winter edition, summer edition,
Yeah,
or, um, because I don't love getting mail, but if I were getting, one magazine, a year or two a year or even three,
yeah,
it'd be like, oh, this is great, and I think there is so much potential for Jill because it just doesn't exist anywhere else in the world, as far as I know.
totally.
Please, if
Yeah.
anyone,
Well, and I think what's neat about it too is there's, you know, even where there are safe digital spaces for us lesbians, it's still a different experience, you know, when you're reading something online and you feel the urge to like or respond right away and write some comment, you know, agreeing or disagreeing. When you have a print magazine in your hand, you can sit down with your tea or whatever and just kind of page through it, or in the gynecologist's office, as you suggested, you know, like it's just portable. I know phones are portable too, but it's portable in a different way, you know?
as somebody who prefers a book to a Kindle, I think there's something really to be said to be able to physically hold it, the glossy pictures, the stickers, and just even, the fact that making the magazine happen takes team effort and takes women working together. So it's like when you hold the magazine, you know that you're holding something that lesbians collaborated together to make happen, and that in itself is beautiful, I think.
Totally. There's some good juju there for sure.
So you mentioned advertising, and I understand Jill is still in the newer phases, but how would you protect the magazine from being, say, ideologically captured or from backlash? Have you received any backlash, or are you not
Yeah,
willing
that's a
to?
really good question. It's actually something my wife was really worried about when I first shared the idea with her. She's like, "Oh my God, the trannies are gonna come and burn down our house," you know. And I'm either a hopeful optimist or maybe I'm just naive. But I always think that if we have a respectful, clear stance, then both can coexist. Again, maybe I'm being naive about that. But on the website, we do have there's a "What is Jill" button, and there's a link, and then there's a link to it that says, "Is Jill transphobic?" You know, and there's just kind of a short statement that basically explains that anybody can read and purchase Jill, but it's a magazine that's intended for lesbians, and this is how we define it. And at this time, well, I don't even think it says at this time, just in general, we only accept submissions from lesbians. So to me, that's not a transphobic statement. I mean, there's lots of spaces that are sort of co-ed or whatever you want to call it. Jill is not one of them, right? I think there's a lot of queer spaces out there, and that's great. If you want to play in the sandbox together, wonderful. But I do believe that women and lesbians in particular still need and deserve our own spaces. And so that's kind of the impetus for creating Jill Magazine. And so, yeah, there has been a bit of pushback in that I've kind of kept it a little bit under the radar. I haven't done massive marketing. The downfall is you don't sell 1 million copies, you only sell 200. But the good part about that is you don't deal with too much blowback because people just don't know about it, right? They haven't sunk their hooks into it yet. However, and so that's the other reason actually that it's print, because then if it's not digital, it can't be like screenshot and shared and, bastardized. However, we did have a few contributors. Oh yeah, I'm excited about a lesbian magazine. Sure, I'll contribute. And then once they found out what it was about, they just messaged me to say, "Oh yeah, I think our philosophies don't align," which was a polite way of saying, I support gender ideology and you don't, so I'm not writing for you, fine, whatever. we don't want their contributions anyway, because it doesn't align with our vision, right? So far it's been fairly benign like that. And I've tried to build bridges with the few individuals who did that and say, hey, I'd like to send you a complimentary copy. Just because I think it'd be great for you to read it. If you don't love it, tell us about why. And, because I have this, again, maybe naive hope that if they see the magazine and read it, they might kind of come to see the light, because all of us peaked at some point, I mean, I know there's a few people who kind of got it from the outset, but I didn't. I was a big supporter of let's be inclusive of everybody. And it took me a long time to kind of figure it out, but I peaked, and I peaked largely actually because of J.K. Rowling's allegedly transphobic blog post that everybody was always talking about a few years ago. Finally read it for myself, and I thought it was very well written, very articulate, and I kept waiting for the transphobic part and it never came. So that's when the light bulb started going on for me, right? So I hope that some of the content in Jill, and it's not all serious, anti-gender ideology stuff. There are some fun things in there too, but there are a few articles that deal with that stuff head on. And I'm hopeful that the lesbians who read it maybe can come back into the fold if they weren't on board with that,
So can you just give maybe a few example of the articles or pieces in Jill? Like you mentioned maybe a couple talk that combat gender ideology, but in this first edition, if someone were to purchase or if they're on the fence about purchasing, what might they be able to read in there?
Well, there's a couple of great just sort of profiles of lesbians. So there's a lesbian couple in Charlottetown, an Italian Canadian couple who lives in Charlottetown, PEI, that are bakers, and they run their own pop-up bakery on Saturday morning. Very like farmers market hippie lesbian vibes. So that's a sort of a fun story. There is a travel sort of log. There's a story about a pilot who's a lesbian, among other things. Kind of interesting, actually, her story. And just a few other, oh, and there's Spot the Difference with, well, I won't give it away, but it's kind of a fun, based on a well-known picture that lesbians will be familiar with. And stuff like that. And then some of the more serious stuff, there's a coming out story. So it's like a personal account. That's really good. And as part of that coming out story, the author had to deal with sort of the shocker of finding online community and then losing online community because it succumbed to the gender ideology and she got labeled. And so newly out and then had to find a new community, that sort of thing. There's a great contribution by an Australian, I think, contributor. I don't have the magazine in front of me, but she writes about women's sports and how women's sports kind of have been compromised over the last while. And that's a really long read, but it's very well written, a very well laid out argument that, again, is not aggressive in my opinion, but just sort of really logically laid out. So if you're sort of new to that, because that's something that's quite shocking to me actually too, as a lesbian who has peaked. When I talk to other lesbians who aren't there yet and they've still, they're drinking the Kool-Aid, it's shocking to me how many of them haven't actually thought about the very real implications of trans-identified men in women's sports, for example, or women's prisons or whatever,
Just the implications of gender ideology.
in general. Yes. Yeah. So I feel like some of those articles might be good wake-up calls for women who just haven't had maybe had the blinders on about that. So
So correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm hearing is that Jill is for both the peaked lesbians that are already with it. It's not so that anyone who's on the fence or maybe even ideologically captured, they could still get the magazine, read it, and find it palatable, and maybe it plants some sort of seed in there where they're like, wow,
Well,
this.
I think so, yes. But if you ask my wife, she would say, you're nuts. You don't know. These people are all crazy. You're going to get labeled as a TERF and a transphobe. And so, you kind of lose perspective sometimes, right? Like we think it's all very benign and fine. But,
Well, yeah,
some people will
I
take offense, I guess. There's also a centerfold. I should tell you, there's a juicy centerfold. It's very exciting, quite salacious, but classy, a
well, this
classy lesbian.
something, you know, has anybody who's not a lesbian, maybe like a man, bought this?
I don't think so. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting, right? Like people email you or make a donation through the GoFundMe. I I don't think there's been any male names that I can recall in the list of 200 or so. Um, yeah, I don't know what I'd do if somebody who is obviously a man wanted to order a copy. I mean, I might just say, oh, are you aware that this is a lesbian magazine? But
As they
again,
charge
I
them
think it
a couple.
hasn't been heavily advertised, so I think it's just not, they wouldn't find us, I don't think. It's only been in lesbian spaces, so I'm kind of hoping that's, you know.
Speaking of lesbian spaces, are you planning at all on attending any Woman's Land's event or
So I
visiting
keep
with the
hearing
magazine?
about Woman's Land. It sounds so awesome. Like,
Oh,
does
you
such a thing
have
really
to go.
exist?
You
I don't think
have
we
to
have that in
go.
Canada.
Come to the States. There's Woman's Land, and Jill magazine you would sell out so much, and you would get so
Cool.
many more subscribers. So I will put you in contact actually with
Yeah.
my contacts because this is
So how, like, well, maybe that's a conversation for another day, but I'm so curious about like, so how do you keep the trans-identified men out of those spaces? Because in Canada, we can't, like, there's all these laws now, right? You're not allowed to discriminate based on gender identity or whatever.
yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a good question. And I've been I one summer I went to two separate women's lands where it was all female, all women. Um, and I don't know what if it was just word of mouth and or I mean, you had to know someone who to get in,
Right. Yeah.
so it's like a secret society,
I
really.
love that. I love
Yeah. And
it.
the fact that I have a foot in the door now to that secret society, I just feel so privileged.
It's pretty
And
great.
also feeling like, so many women, lesbian women would benefit from that sort of community. So Jill
Yeah.
Magazine would be a fantastic opportunity for Woman's Land to advertise itself
Yes.
in
Yeah.
a safe environment.
Yeah.
With
Yeah. Well, and so I think that, getting back to your earlier question about how do you kind of make sure it doesn't get compromised, I think if we had advertisers, which we'd love to do, for a company or a business or an organization to whom it's germane, that would be awesome, like what you're suggesting, Women's Land. So we do actually have a little advertiser button at the top of the website now for our next issue in case people are interested in advertising. But we're just, the website is very clear. This is what we're about. So if somebody who advertises with us chooses to do that, that's what they get. They get a quarter page or a half page or a page. They don't get to say, what we publish and what we don't publish. Like if they don't like it, then they should go advertise somewhere else, I guess.
In the next issue, is there anything that you're wanting more of? Like, just throwing this out there, I have a comic strip idea. Uh, and I just, maybe that could be something that Jill magazine features, hypothetically, obviously. But, so is there any other sort of content that you would like to see in Jill magazine?
Yeah, I love that you brought up the comic strip thing. Actually, I had this idea for a comic strip, Butch and Dyke, and it's about a Butch or a Dyke and her cat, who's named Butch or Dyke, depending, right? So, and I have a Mexican artist, woman here who actually drew three different just panels. And then I had this wonderful stand-up comedian who was going to write, the jokes to go with it. And then she found out that, we define lesbians as women. That was a problem for her. Unfortunately, I was very sad because I think she's one too who's kind of being sucked into the ideology, but she's masculine presenting. And as we know, the butches have all disappeared, pretty much dried up, right? They've all been sucked into the gender ideology cult. So I even took her out for lunch because I thought, if she meets me and sees I'm not a bad guy, yeah, so she kind of bailed. She's one I sent a free copy to because we did publish the comic anyway and without captions. And one of the things is, hey, caption this and we'll include it in the next issue. So I'm hoping when she sees the magazine, I don't know, either she'll be convinced, oh yeah, it's totally transphobic and turfy, or she'll see, oh yeah, it's actually, makes sense. And I wish I had contributed, and maybe she'll contribute to a future issue. Who knows? So yeah, I'm all about the comics and stuff like that. I think it's great to include both sort of politically charged lesbian comic strips, but also, just fun lesbian comics. And similarly, I'd love to see more, I don't know if fashions the right word. We do have a fashion
You
spread.
read my mind.
I know. Like I
Panels,
want to
are they
see
in or
lesbians.
out?
I like pictures of lesbians, right? So I think more of that would be great. Like if we had a consistent photographer or somebody who is willing to contribute. And the other thing I'd like to see more of that we really didn't have any of this issue, sort of a little bit, but it wasn't lesbian specific, is history. I think we have this opportunity for the next maybe 2 decades at most to get some really important lesbian history from some of our older sisters who are, I hate to say dying, but they are, right? Like they're in their senior years now, they're in their third act. And some of them have shared stuff virtually, but as somebody pointed out to me, online spaces can disappear in a heartbeat. So yeah, I would love to see more lesbian history, like whether it's interviews with older lesbians or whether it's older lesbians contributing themselves, pieces and stories of history, because then we have documentation of that. And maybe, the 50 copies in the US go missing, but there's 27 in Canada and 4 people in Australia who've ordered them. And so you have this hard copy of this history that's documented as opposed to on a website somewhere that could go dark, whatever, right? I think it's ironically not as reliable as print copies. So I'd like to see more history. We have now had several older lesbians order the magazine, but early on when it was being developed, because most of it was virtual and I was advertising virtually and trying to hustle up writers, through Twitter and Instagram, they're not on there. Not the old lesbians aren't on those platforms. They might be on Facebook, some of them, but a lot of them they've had enough of that shit and they have their little circle of friends and they're living their life and they're not doing all that stuff that we and the under 50 crowd are doing, So if there was a way to get more of that and capture some of that, that'd be good.
Well, before we wrap up, do you have any final thoughts or statements that you'd like to share about Jill Magazine?
Yeah, I want to tell you briefly the story about the lesbian stereotype with pets, right? So we
Yes.
wanted to have a pet page, and it's actually the last page. So apropos to your question, the last word is for the pets. And I thought we'd get all these submissions from lesbians and their cats, right? Because lesbians are all cat ladies. But every single lesbian who submitted a pet photo, it was dogs. And actually predominantly one kind of dog. I won't say which in case, people haven't ordered their copy yet, want to see, but it was quite funny. So I don't know if the stereotype is wrong or the cat people just didn't find us, but it's all dogs. All the lesbians and their pets are
You
dogs
can
on the
edit.
last page. Last words, thanks for having me on. Thanks for sharing about it. It's, as you say, it's sort of through these secret clubs and societies and groups that word gets out. But I'd love every lesbian who wanted this kind of magazine as badly as I did to get a copy in her hands. I think we have about 30 copies left of this first issue. So if anybody wants one, go on the website, jillmag.weebly.com. I can send it to you later so you can write it in somewhere. And yeah, get a copy and we'll mail it out to you. Or either my wife or one of my sons will mail it out to you because they're in Canada. So
And I, not for nothing, I think you said it's a finite amount. About 30 copies you said left.
yeah.
This is a historic piece of literature that you've created, frankly, and it is an honor to be able to own one and be part of this lesbian history that you've established. So kudos to you for just taking charge of something that needed to happen and creating something really special and really important. And I cannot wait for the next issue. I don't care how long it takes. I will wait. And I hope that you get a lot of financial support, but also just more contributors and more people buying. And just thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for all that you did, all the effort that you put into making this happen, because it really is helping make the world a better place for lesbians.
Well, thanks so much. And it's, right back at you because it's people like you who are kind of sharing the story on your platforms that are getting it into the hands of more lesbians. And we invite anybody who's interested in providing feedback, good or bad. If you hated it and thought it sucked, let us know. So the next issue can be better. And if you want to join the board too, we'd love to have your voice and your input. Thanks.
Thank you everyone for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe and order your copy of Jill's magazine's first edition, limited edition. Thank you, everyone, and we will see you next time.